Walt Doyle almost said no. 3 months after burying Bear, the German shepherd who had worked beside him for 11 years, the last thing Walt wanted was to walk into a police station and examine another grieving dog. He had spent most of his adult life telling handlers not to confuse pain with disobedience. He knew all the correct words. He knew the difference between avoidance, shutdown, fear, overstimulation, and refusal. None of that knowledge had helped him enter his own empty kitchen without listening for Bear's nails against the floor. Still, a little over 2 weeks after Captain Renata Cruz called him, Walt would stand at the back of a small decommissioning ceremony and watch a Belgian Malinois leave his side, cross a silent crowd, and lie down beside the empty chair of a handler who was never coming back. What happened after that would not heal Walt. It would not make Ranger forget Deputy Sam Ellison. It would only prove that leaving the chair did not have to mean leaving Sam behind. Cedar Falls was a small Pennsylvania town with one police station, one diner that stayed open past midnight, and a river that iced over every winter thick enough to tempt people who should have known better. Walt lived 20 minutes outside town in an old farmhouse with a sagging porch, a fenced half-acre, and more rooms than he used. Until 3 months earlier, most of the property had belonged to Bear. Bear had entered Walt's life during the final 2 years of his Army service. Walt was 44 then, already experienced with working dogs and confident enough to mistake experience for certainty. Bear had been a young black and tan German shepherd with a stubborn stare and a habit of ignoring any command he considered poorly timed. For the first 3 weeks, Walt thought the dog was testing him. By the third month, he understood that Bear was not testing anyone. He was watching. He wanted to know whether the man holding the leash would remain steady when frustrated, whether correction would become anger, and whether trust would be treated as something earned rather than demanded. Once Bear made his decision, he stayed with Walt through the rest of his service, the transition back to civilian life, and 9 years of contract work helping state and municipal departments train canine teams. 11 years in total. Bear had been there through Walt's divorce from Diane, through the first winter in the farmhouse, through the nights when old memories made sleep feel like an argument Walt could not win. In early spring, at 14 years old, Bear died quietly in his sleep in the warmest corner of the porch. Walt buried him under the oak tree near the property line. He did it alone. He did not call Diane. He did not call his sister. He did not call the 2 former handlers who still checked on him every month. For 3 weeks, nobody knew. Afterward, Walt told people he was fully retired. He was 55, tall, still strong through the shoulders, with close gray-brown hair and the unhurried movements of a man who had spent decades observing before acting. He no longer accepted long contracts. He no longer traveled to departments that wanted a difficult dog corrected in one weekend. He no longer kept training equipment in the truck. At least that was what he told himself. Captain Renata Cruz had known Walt since his first year as a civilian contractor. As a young state trooper, she had arrived at one of his early training courses with a nervous bloodhound mix that refused to work around engines. Walt had spent 2 months teaching both dog and handler how to slow down. Now Cruz ran the Cedar Falls Police Department and coordinated Riverbend County's small shared canine unit. She called on a Thursday afternoon. "I need an evaluator Ranger has never worked with," she said. "Someone without a personal history here. Someone who won't tell me what I want to hear." Walt stood at his kitchen window, looking toward the oak tree. What happened to his handler? The silence on the line lasted half a second too long. Deputy Sam Ellison died on duty 3 months ago. Cardiac arrest during a traffic stop, 41 years old. And Ranger? Stayed with him until paramedics arrived. 11 minutes. Wouldn't let patrol officers approach, but allowed the medical team through once they brought the stretcher. That sounds controlled. It was. But he hasn't taken a new handler since. He'll respond to basic care routines, but operational commands are inconsistent. He leaves assigned positions. He returns to Sam's desk whenever he gets access to the bullpen. Walt looked away from the tree. How old? 7. Belgian Malinois, 5 years in service. Any aggression after the incident? No unprovoked aggression, no bites, but he has advanced patrol and apprehension training. The county can't place him as an ordinary pet, and no department will accept him without a qualified evaluation. What happens if he isn't placed? The unit is being dissolved at the end of the month. 2 dogs have already transferred to the neighboring county. Ranger's insurance authorization expires with the program. If we cannot arrange a qualified handler placement, foster agreement, or specialist sanctuary, the county risk office will classify him as unassigned. After that, the decision moves above my level. Cruz did not describe the possible outcomes. She did not need to. Working dogs trained for apprehension were rarely given unlimited time. Liability traveled with them even when the behavior problem was grief rather than aggression. "How long do you have?" Walt asked. 15 days. "You're asking for an evaluation. I'm asking you to tell me whether he can safely leave here." Walt almost said no. Instead, he asked, "When do you want me?" The Cedar Falls station looked smaller than he remembered. 4 desks occupied the main bullpen. Cardboard boxes lined one wall, marked for county storage or surplus auction. The old canine run behind the building had already been dismantled, leaving Ranger temporarily housed in a converted supply room with a secure kennel gate. Cruz met Walt at the front desk. "He has not threatened staff," she said as they walked toward the back. "I want that clear. People here won't take a handler and imagine a dangerous dog. Sometimes the dangerous part is the person trying too hard. That is why I called you." Ranger stood inside the kennel. He was a dark fawn Malinois with a black mask and premature gray around the muzzle. His body was lean, healthy, and tightly controlled. He looked at Walt once, took in his posture, his hands, the position of the door, and then looked away. Walt stayed outside the threshold. "Ranger," Cruz said, "heel." The dog did not move. She waited. Ranger turned his head toward the bullpen. Then he rose, walked past Cruz and Walt without urgency, crossed the main room, and lay down beside an empty desk chair. The chair had been pushed slightly away from the desk, as though its owner had stood up quickly and expected to return. 2 officers near the coffee machine stopped talking. Nobody told the dog to move. "That was Sam's desk," Cruz said. Walt watched Ranger settle with his chin against one metal chair leg. The dog was not scanning the room. He was not guarding the chair in an aggressive sense. He was waiting. "Has anyone moved it?" Walt asked. "No." "Why not?" Cruz looked toward the officers. "Because it felt wrong." Walt nodded. The dog was not the only one fixed to the chair. "Give me the 15 days, he said. "I'll tell you what I see." Walt did not begin with commands. On the first day, he sat in the break room where Ranger could see him. He brought no training leash, no tug, no food reward. Ranger remained near Sam's chair. Walt drank the station's coffee and read Ranger's records from the beginning. The dog had entered service at 18 months with high drive, poor impulse control, and strong environmental confidence. Sam trained him for patrol, tracking, and article searches. His bite work scores were good. His public demonstration notes were better. Ranger had visited elementary schools, county fairs, and retirement homes. He tolerated children touching his ears and veterans leaning too much weight against his back. Nothing in the file described an unstable dog. On the second day, Walt sat closer. Ranger did not acknowledge him. On the third day, the dog shifted several inches away from the chair and settled near the break room doorway. Walt did not reward the movement. He did not want Ranger to believe that every decision would become a test. He simply remained where he was. Officer Mateo Reyes spoke to Walt near the coffee machine on the 4th day. Reyes had worked with Sam for 10 years. He was heavy-set, soft-spoken, and tired in the way people often looked after grieving in public for too long. "Sam brought Ranger to the schools every fall," Reyes said. "Career day, 40 kids around him, and the dog never lost patience. I saw the reports. Reports don't show Sam singing the cleanup song while the kids helped put the cones away." There was a cleanup song? Sam could turn anything into a bad song. Reyes smiled once, then lost it. He raised his daughter alone, Maddie, 11 years old now. She used to spend Saturdays here when her aunt worked. Ranger slept at the foot of her bed whenever Sam had night shift. "Why isn't Ranger with her?" Reyes looked toward the empty chair. "Maddie lives with Sam's sister now, apartment in the next town. No dogs over 40 pounds, and her aunt has no handling experience. Even if the landlord agreed, the county risk office would never transfer an apprehension-trained canine into a home with a child and no qualified adult handler." That answered the practical question. It did not make the answer kinder. "Has Maddie seen him?" Twice. First time he wouldn't leave the chair. Second time he stood, then lay back down. She cried both times. Walt looked at Ranger. Grief doesn't erase what a dog learned, he said. It changes what feels worth doing. Reyes nodded slowly. On the fifth day, Walt brought a leash. He did not clip it on. He placed it on the floor several feet from Ranger, then sat near the break room wall. Ranger looked at the leash, then at Walt. His chin returned to the floor. I know, Walt said quietly. The words came before he decided to speak. They were the same words he had used with Bear during long nights after deployment, and again during Bear's final winter, when the old dog could no longer climb the porch steps without help. I know what that chair means. Ranger's ears moved. Walt told him about Bear, not in the soft artificial voice people sometimes used around dogs, but in the same plain tone he would have used with another handler. He spoke about 11 years, about the oak tree, about carrying Bear down the porch steps during the last week, about waking the morning after the burial and setting out 2 bowls before remembering there was only one living thing left in the house. Ranger did not come closer. He did not offer a paw or lift his head as if understanding every word. But when Walt finished, the dog remained in the break room doorway instead of returning immediately to the chair. It was not proof of anything. It was enough for that day. By the end of the first week, Cruz had realized Walt was not conducting the kind of evaluation the county board expected. She stood in the break room doorway while Ranger lay several feet from Walt. You haven't tested obedience under pressure, she said. Pressure is the one thing we already know he can survive. The board wants a placement recommendation. They want a simple answer to a complicated dog. They still need an answer by Friday. Walt looked at Ranger. The dog had raised his head at the sound of Walt's voice. Then my answer today is that he is not ready for operational reassignment. Cruz folded her arms. That could end his chances. Sending him to another department because he performs 3 commands in a parking lot could end someone else's. What are you recommending? I'm not there yet. You still have time. Not much, but some. Walt nodded. I know. Early in the second week, Maddie Ellison came to the station after school. She was small for 11, with dark hair tied back and the same steady eyes Walt had seen in Sam's photograph. Her backpack remained on both shoulders, as though she did not intend to stay long enough to take it off. Sam's sister, Laura, waited near the front desk. I told her this might be hard, Laura said quietly. Hard isn't always the wrong thing, Walt answered. Maddie entered the bullpen. Ranger's head lifted before she spoke. Hi, she said. The dog stood. He looked at the chair, then back at Maddie. For several seconds, he did not move. Maddie stopped halfway across the room. You don't have to, she whispered. Ranger walked to her. He pressed the side of his head against her waist. Maddie dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around his neck. The officers in the bullpen turned away, offering them privacy without leaving. Walt stayed near the break room. Ranger had not responded to a command. He had made a choice. Maddie remained for an hour. She sat cross-legged on the floor with Ranger's head in her lap and told Walt about Sam's terrible singing voice. She described Saturday pancakes burned black at the edges and renamed extra crispy. She told him Ranger used to steal one of her socks whenever Sam packed for a training weekend. People keep saying Dad is in a better place, she said. Walt looked at the dog. I don't know what people mean when they say that. Maddie looked up, surprised. Adults usually say they know. Adults say many things because silence makes them nervous. Do you think Ranger knows Dad is dead? Walt considered the question. I think he knows Sam stopped moving. People came, and then Sam never returned. Dogs may not explain death the way we do, but they understand absence. Maddie stroked the first gray hairs around Ranger's muzzle. Can he live with us? Laura looked down. Walt answered carefully. He has training that makes him different from a family pet. Your aunt's apartment does not allow him, and the county would require an experienced adult handler. I'm experienced with him. You know him, Walt said. That matters. But knowing someone and being responsible for everything they might do are not always the same. Maddie's face tightened. That isn't fair. No, Walt said, it isn't. She looked back at Ranger. What happens to him? That is what we are trying to decide. Maddie came back the next afternoon. This time, Ranger left the chair before she reached the middle of the room. On her third visit, she carried the leash outside with Walt beside her and Laura several steps behind. Ranger walked with Maddie to the maple tree behind the station, then stopped and looked back toward the building. Walt waited. Ranger eventually continued. Each trip away from the chair lasted only a few minutes. Each return was voluntary. Walt began to understand the pattern. Ranger did not believe the chair itself was Sam. He believed leaving it was a failure of duty. The final county budget meeting took place on Wednesday, 2 days before the Friday deadline. Councilwoman Patricia Hensley chaired the meeting. She was not cruel. She was efficient, impatient, and responsible for a budget that had been shrinking for years. Crews presented the K-9 unit closeout report. The final page listed Ranger by identification number beneath a line labeled unresolved placement. "I am requesting a 30-day extension," Crews said. "We have a qualified evaluator documenting progress and exploring a supervised foster placement." Hensley adjusted her glasses. "Who pays for the additional insurance coverage?" "The department can absorb part of it." "From which line?" Crews named a training account that was already nearly empty. Hensley looked toward Walt, seated in the back row. "And the evaluator believes this dog can be placed?" Walt stood. "I believe he can be placed with restrictions." "Name and qualifications?" "Walt Doyle, former Army K-9 handler. 15 years working with military and police dogs, including 9 years contracting with departments in this state." "Can he return to service?" "Not now." "Can he be adopted as a standard household pet?" "No." "Then what exactly are you proposing?" "A 60-day foster-to-placement period with an experienced handler. No operational use. Controlled contact. Continued evaluation. If the dog stabilizes, permanent retirement placement can be considered." "And do you have such a handler?" "Not yet." Hensley leaned back. "The program authorization ends Friday. Liability coverage for an unassigned apprehension-trained dog is not an abstract problem. It is a legal and financial one." "I understand. Do you?" Her question was sharp but not mocking. Walt held her gaze. "Yes, I also understand that the behavior being called non-compliance began after he watched his handler die and guarded him until medics arrived. That is not evidence of a defective dog. It is evidence of a bond the department intentionally built. Bonds do not pay claims." "No," Walt said, "but rushing a dog into the wrong placement creates claims." The room stayed quiet. Hensley closed the report. "I can authorize coverage through the decommissioning ceremony on Saturday. After that, Captain Crews must submit a name placement, a qualified handler agreement, and a written risk plan. Without those, the county administrator makes the final disposition." It was not the 30 days Crews requested. It was only 1 day beyond the existing deadline. In the parking lot afterward, Crews exhaled hard into the cold air. "You told them we don't have a handler." "We don't." "You could have said you were considering it." "I am not sure that I am." Crews studied him. "You have brought a leash every day this week." "That does not mean I am taking him home." "No," she said. "It means part of you already knows why you keep bringing it." Walt drove home without the radio. At the farmhouse, he sat in Bear's old place on the porch and looked toward the oak tree. The practical objections were easy to list. Ranger was 7, physically powerful, trained to bite on command, and emotionally fixed to a dead handler. Walt's property was suitable, but suitability was not commitment. A 60-day foster would require insurance, structured handling, veterinary review, written county oversight, and the possibility that Ranger would fail to adapt. There was another objection Walt did not say aloud. If he let Ranger into the house, he would eventually lose him too. Every working dog relationship ended in separation, retirement, reassignment, injury, age, death. Knowing that did not make beginning easier. Walt called Diane. They had been divorced 2 years, but she remained the person he called when a decision felt too large to carry privately. After he explained, she was quiet. "You already know what you want to do," she said. "No. You know what you are afraid to do. That is not the same thing." "It usually is with you." Walt rubbed one hand across his face. "He is not Bear." "I know. I don't want him to be." "Then don't ask him to be." Walt looked toward the empty porch corner. Diane continued, "You buried Bear alone. You did not call anyone for 3 weeks. Whatever happens with Ranger, do not turn grief into another reason to disappear." I would be taking responsibility for a dog I may not be able to reach. Maybe. Or you would be giving both of you a place to be unreachable for a while without being abandoned. Walt had no answer. The next morning, Maddie called the station. She asked whether she could see Ranger before Saturday. Laura drove her over that afternoon. Ranger came away from the chair as soon as he heard Maddie's voice. They walked behind the station. Maddie held a short secondary lead while Walt retained the primary leash in full control. At the maple tree, Maddie stopped. "Mr. Doyle?" "Yes?" "Are you going to take him?" Walt looked at Ranger. "I am considering a temporary placement. Temporary means you can give him back. It also means the county can remove him if it is not safe." Maddie looked down at the leash. "Will he forget Dad if he lives somewhere else?" "No." "You sound sure." "I am." "How?" Walt thought about Bear's bowl still sitting on a shelf in the mudroom because he had not been able to throw it away. "Because loving someone new does not remove the person who came before." Maddie did not speak for several steps. Then she said, "He sleeps by the door when he is waiting for someone." Walt looked at her. "At our old house, when Dad worked late, Ranger slept by the front door until he heard the truck." That detail stayed with Walt. Thursday evening, he called Cruz. "I will sign a 60-day foster agreement," he said. "Retirement placement only. No operational deployment. County veterinary exam before transfer. Written authority for me to return him if either of us is unsafe." Cruz did not answer immediately. "You are certain?" "No. That may be the most honest placement recommendation I have heard all month. I also want Maddie listed for supervised visits. I can put it in the plan. And the chair stays until after the ceremony." Cruz's voice softened. It was going to. 2 days later, the decommissioning ceremony took place in the station parking lot. There were no television crews and no large crowd. A few dozen townspeople attended, along with officers from neighboring departments, the handlers of the 2 transferred dogs, county staff, and several families who had met the K-9 teams at school demonstrations. Folding chairs faced a small platform. Sam Ellison's empty chair stood near the front beside a framed photograph of him with Ranger. There was no dramatic display, only the chair, the photograph, and Sam's badge in a simple case. Maddie sat with Laura in the first row. Walt stood at the back with Ranger. The dog wore a flat working collar and a standard leash. Walt kept the line loose but secure. Ranger had worked calmly with him for short periods during the previous 2 days, though he still ignored some commands and checked repeatedly toward the station doors. The foster agreement was signed. It was not yet a permanent adoption. Captain Cruz began the closing remarks. She named the 2 dogs transferred to the neighboring county and thanked their handlers. Then she spoke about the 5 years Ranger and Sam had served Cedar Falls. When she said Sam's name, Ranger's ears lifted. His body moved forward. Walt felt the leash tighten. He did not correct him. He opened his hand enough to give the dog room while keeping control of the line. Ranger walked through the aisle between the folding chairs. The crowd became quiet. He reached Sam's chair and lay down beside it. His chin rested against the same metal leg he had guarded for 3 months. Walt remained at the back. He did not call him. This was not a recall exercise. It was not a public test of whether Ranger had chosen a new handler. Maddie stood. She approached the chair and knelt beside the dog. For a while, she said nothing. Then she put one hand against Ranger's neck. "You don't have to wait here every day," she whispered. The words were quiet, but the parking lot was silent enough that Walt heard them. Ranger remained beside the chair. Maddie stayed with him until Cruz finished speaking. There was no sudden transformation, no perfect symbolic moment in which Ranger immediately abandoned the past and crossed the crowd toward Walt. When people began folding chairs, Ranger finally stood. He followed Maddie several steps. Then he stopped between her and Walt. Maddie looked back. "Go on," she said. Ranger did not move. Walt lowered himself carefully to one knee several yards away. He did not give a command. He waited. Ranger looked toward the empty chair, then toward Maddie, then toward Walt. After nearly 10 seconds, he walked back. He stopped within arm's reach, but did not lean against Walt or offer affection. Walt clipped his fingers lightly around the leash. "Good," he said. That was all. Councilwoman Hensley watched from the rear of the crowd. She did not applaud or offer an emotional apology, Before leaving, she handed Cruz a signed copy of the temporary insurance authorization. The paperwork mattered more than a nod. Reyes helped move Sam's chair into the station lobby. It would remain there until the department and family decided what to do with it. Nobody ordered a plaque that afternoon. Some decisions needed time. Ranger rode to Walt's farmhouse in a secured crate in the back of the truck. He did not put his head out the window. He paced inside the crate for the first 10 minutes, then sat facing the rear doors. At the farmhouse, Walt walked him around the fenced property before entering the house. Ranger checked every doorway, every window, and the path to the road. He sniffed Bear's old porch corner and moved away. That evening, he refused dinner. At 10 o'clock, Walt found him lying beside the front door. At midnight, the dog was still there. At 2 in the morning, Walt carried a blanket into the hallway and placed it several feet from Ranger. He sat against the wall. Ranger watched him. Walt did not call him closer. "He is not coming through that door," Walt said quietly. Ranger's ears moved. Walt looked toward the dark window in the door. "Mine isn't either." Near dawn, Ranger lowered his head onto the floor. He did not move to the blanket, but he slept. The first week was difficult. Ranger ate only when Walt left the kitchen. He followed some commands and ignored others. If a vehicle slowed near the driveway, he went rigid at the front window. Twice, he scratched at the truck crate after Walt parked at the station for required follow-up evaluations. Each time they entered the building, Ranger returned to Sam's chair. Walt allowed him several minutes there, then walked toward the exit. The first visit, Ranger did not follow until Maddie arrived. The second visit, he followed Walt after 30 seconds. The third, he looked at the chair and then chose the door. Progress did not move in a straight line. On the 12th night, a thunderstorm rolled across the county. Ranger paced between the front door and the mudroom. Walt sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read. Eventually, Ranger lay beneath the table, not beside Walt's feet, close enough to hear him breathe. Maddie visited on Sundays when Laura's schedule allowed. The first time, Ranger reached the end of the driveway before Laura's car had fully stopped. Walt caught the long line before the dog reached the road. Maddie climbed out and wrapped her arms around him. For 2 hours, Ranger followed her everywhere. When it was time to leave, he walked beside the car for several yards. Walt called his name. Ranger continued another step. Walt called once more without raising his voice. Then he stopped. He looked at the departing car. Then he returned slowly. Maddie watched through the rear window. Walt did not interpret the return as proof that Ranger loved him more. It was only proof that the way could remain connected to someone who left and still return to someone who stayed. At the 30-day review, the county veterinarian found Ranger physically healthy. Cruz documented improved response, reduced fixation on the station, and safe handling under Walt's control. The report also listed continuing concerns. Ranger remained highly alert to emergency vehicles. He showed inconsistent obedience in unfamiliar environments. He experienced periods of appetite loss after visits with Maddie. He was not suitable for operational reassignment or placement with an inexperienced family. Hensley approved the remaining 30 days of the foster agreement. She did not praise Walt. She asked whether the liability rider had been paid. It had. Walt respected the consistency, even when he disliked it. During the second month, Casey Mercer, a young deputy from another town, called Walt about a patrol dog that shut down during environmental training. Walt initially refused. Then he agreed to watch one session. Ranger came with him, but remained crated away from the working field. Walt spent 40 minutes observing the young handler apply more pressure every time the dog became uncertain. "Stop asking for obedience while he is trying to feel safe," Walt finally said. The handler looked irritated. Walt did not soften the point. Lower the task, reward the first voluntary movement, build from there. The dog took 2 steps, then 4. Walt left before the session ended. In the truck, his hands shook above the steering wheel. Returning to a training field had not healed him. It had reopened something. But reopened was not the same as destroyed. Ranger watched him through the crate door. Walt sat until his hands became still enough to drive. Near the end of the 60-day period, Cruz arrived at the farmhouse with the final placement documents. Permanent retirement transfer. No police authority, no operational use. Continued veterinary care and liability requirements. Supervised contact with Maddie. A clause allowing the county to review placement if a serious incident occurred. Walt read every page. You can still decline, Cruz said. Ranger lay on the porch several feet from Bear's old spot. I know. Are you going to? Walt looked at the dog. Ranger looked back, then rested his head on his paws. No, he signed. Permanent did not mean guaranteed. Ranger was 7 years old. His training history would always require care. His grief did not disappear when the paperwork changed. Walt's did not either. The chair remained in the Cedar Falls station lobby through the end of winter. Later, Sam's family agreed to move it to a small memorial corner with his photograph and service record. There was no elaborate plaque, only a card bearing his name and years of service. Maddie did not visit every Sunday. Sometimes school, weather, or Laura's work schedule interfered. When she came, Ranger still greeted her with an intensity he showed no one else. Walt did not resent that. Diane visited once during the spring. She brought coffee and stood on the porch while Ranger watched her carefully. I expected him to be in Bear's spot, she said. He tried it once, left after a minute. Maybe it doesn't belong to him. Maybe no place belongs to only one memory. Diane looked at Walt. That sounded almost healthy. Don't get used to it. She laughed. She left after an hour. They did not begin dating again. They did not repair the marriage in one afternoon. But Walt called her the following week without needing a crisis as an excuse. That was something. Walt accepted occasional training consultations that spring, a handful, not a new career. Some days he enjoyed the work. Other days he came home exhausted by memories and did not answer the phone for a week. Ranger was not used as a demonstration dog or brought into active police work. He became, gradually, a retired dog living with a man who understood that retirement was not the same as forgetting how to listen for danger. Near the end of spring, Walt moved Bear's old bowl from the mudroom shelf into a storage box. He did not throw it away. He simply stopped keeping it where he would see it every morning. That evening, Ranger lay beside the front door. A truck slowed on the road. The dog raised his head and listened until the engine faded. Then he stood and walked into the kitchen. Walt sat at the table reviewing notes from a young handler's training session. Ranger stopped several feet away. Walt did not call him. After a moment, the dog crossed the room and lay beneath the table. Not in Bear's place, not beside Sam's chair, a place of his own. Walt lowered one hand. Ranger looked at it, then rested his chin against Walt's boot. Neither of them had moved on in the clean way people like to describe. They had not left anyone behind. They had only learned that grief could travel with them without choosing every direction. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Silent Ranks K9 for more stories about working dogs, veterans, loyalty, and recovery that does not happen all at once. And tell us in the comments, do you think a dog's grief is different from ours, or do we simply express the same loss in different ways?